Hey everybody, in this video I'll talk about which guide rail length is right for you in various applications with the dashboard system. Okay, so if you're going to use the guide rail brackets, regardless of whatever table you're working with, you should figure 13 inches of rail length beyond the width of that table at a minimum in order to be able to attach it to the rear bracket and have it come down and lay fully across the front bracket. That's only going to be out to the front of this plate. So you'll probably want some extra so there's room to set your saw down and plunge the blade before you start cutting. Now I put the outrigger on the front of the bench because we're going to start looking at some wider cuts. I've got the 55-inch rail, 1400 millimeters, set up here in the guide rail brackets with the spiral dog positioned, so it's going to be about as far out in one of these slots as I think is reasonable, because we want to make sure it's still fully in the slot to register properly. So in this configuration, we can take a little measurement here and get a sense of what is the maximum you can cut. So the fence is set as far back as it's going to go. Realistically, about 44 1/4 or 1125 millimeters. And so that's a maximum, but you also have to consider the space your saw occupies on the rail and whether you want to plunge into what you're cutting or plunge first and then start cutting. All right, so I have this representative chunk of wood here, and here I set my saw down on the rail. So you can see it's about as far back on the rail as I think you want to go. You could go a little bit farther because the tensioning knobs are still grabbing back here. So here's what I mean by setting it down and plunging into or plunging first and then cutting. You can see here, if this piece of wood is here, then I can plunge fully and then begin my cut, which is, I think, a little more controlled than plunging into something, plus probably a little bit cleaner at the start of it. But if you want, you can plunge into it and get a little bit wider capacity. But if you really want to go wide, we'll go with the wingman. All right, here's my 4-foot wide sheet. So if you want to think about cross-cutting that, you have to pay attention to the fact that the sheet is going to cover up the slots here. So I'm not going to be able to get my spiral dog into that. And so the way to get past that is that we're going to use the wingman to extend this surface, but you're also going to use a longer rail. All right, the wingman is attached, it just screws in place, and it is automatically self-aligning with the slot that it's replacing. So you don't have to worry about reconfiguring anything, just put it on and use it. So now, speaking of a longer rail, here's my 55-inch. Now you can see, obviously that doesn't work. So I need something longer. Now I've installed the 1600 millimeter rail. So as you can see, here's my sheet, here's my spiral dog, drops right in the slot. I have no problem with that. I can put this saw on the rail, and I can actually hang it off the back a little bit, because as long as the tensioning knob doesn't lose contact with the rail, I know I'm not going to shift at all. So I can make that cut. So there is just enough room to plunge before cutting. Now, of course, one thing to consider is that the thicker your material is, the more length you're going to need if you intend to plunge before cutting. So that is something to keep in mind. I have done lots of 3/4 material, 18 millimeter, with a 1600 millimeter rail. You do cut into it a little bit before starting, or I should say on plunging, but it hasn't been a problem for me. So Festool does make a 1900 millimeter rail that is going to give you that extra length you would need for thicker material. And you can use the Bosch or Mafell saw on that type of rail with a little modification to the base. It's no problem. And then, of course, all the other typical saws will run on that. So that's another way to go, a 1900 millimeter rail, if you really want to have a little extra length for crosscuts of full sheets. But, and you can also buy little short sections of that rail and put it on with some connector bars. Really depends on how often you do this. I always like to have a one-piece rail. And so Metabo rail, Bosch rail, they're both 1600 millimeters. I think the Metabo is a bit cheaper, but they're otherwise interchangeable. So that's how we can set up for full sheet crosscuts. And earlier I covered the narrower crosscuts. So now we'll move on to rips. So switching over to the long rip configuration. Let's say I want to rip this 8-foot board, 2440 millimeters. I have here the 2700 millimeter rail, 106¼ inches. And since that's longer than the board, you might think, oh, there's no problem ripping this thing without any special accommodations. To an extent, that's true, but we need to take a closer look at it. So I've got the saw way at the end of the rail. I've got the board positioned between the two ends in such a way that I can have the saw hanging a little bit off the end, but both tension knobs are still grabbing the profile of the rail, and I can plunge deep enough, as you can see, to cut through that board. This is 3/4 or 18 millimeter material. So yes, if you're very careful about where you start and you don't let the tension knob at the back of the saw go off of the rail, you can do this and it's fine, unless you want to plunge into the material. Now, if this stuff gets thicker, let's say you're cutting something twice as thick, you want to have more room back here to plunge first, but your saw will come off the track. So that's a consideration. But let's take the example of this 3/4 inch material and run down to the other end and see where things pan out down there. So here we are at the other end. And as you can see, I had come along here. I'm cutting through the board, and right there, I finished the cut. I'm almost off the rail at the front of the saw. So all this is to say, you can use the 2700 millimeter rail as long as you're careful on both ends, and probably as long as what you're cutting is not super thick and you don't want to plunge into it before you start moving. Okay, so the next step would be to connect two shorter rails to get a longer length. I have two 55-inch rails here, 1400 millimeters. So we get 110 inches or 2800 millimeters, which certainly leaves you enough room to plunge before cutting and then finish the cut without worrying about running off the rail. This is a common solution to that problem. I'm not a fan of it, mostly because the connectors I have found to be really all unreliable. And you have to treat the whole thing like it's made of glass when they're put together. So I've got some steel bars, which are strong. They are just held in place with set screws. And then I have also messed around with some of the nicer, more fancy designs. These have a pretty smart self-aligning or self-centering feature, which I think is great, but they're made of aluminum, which makes them very easily bent. And they're also expensive. So I've always been let down by these types of connectors. It really depends on how much you're willing to gamble and how carefully you can treat these when they're connected. You know, the experts will tell you, don't touch them to each other when you make the connection, because they're not reliably square. So I don't understand why the people who make these rails can't take that one extra step when they cut them to length to then maybe machine them square. So this is not a problem. It makes no sense to me. So the thing is, imagine these aren't touching and the only connection you have is these two thin sticks, whether they're aluminum or steel. It creates a lot of force on those two little things. That's why the aluminum ones bend, because they're all that's holding these two things together, and there's a lot of leverage here. The steel ones can shift, at least in my experience. Your experience may vary. So whatever method you use, just if you can be successful if you treat it really carefully, and you make sure that they're as straight as possible when you do put them together. I've had the experience of cutting multiple long sheets, and I found out through a lot of frustration a little bit farther down the line that what I cut was actually a shallow V. And it was so shallow I couldn't see it in the rail, but it affected crosscuts and it drove me nuts. There's also having, bent a couple pairs of these aluminum ones, and they're like $90. So I understand why a lot of people would need to put two rails together. It's much easier to transport them, and you might not have space to store a single long rail. So sure, you can do that, and everybody has an opinion, but that's mine. Now, I can't leave this topic without mentioning the Mafell/Bosch rail. They have a different kind of connector. It doesn't go over under like sticks do. It has this steel bar that is pressed in place against both sides of a shallow depression, which is sort of a dovetail shape, and uses some cams to do that. Now, that has a great alignment. It also has a lot of surface area. So I still wouldn't touch the rails to each other because I always use a straight edge when I'm connecting two rails, however that goes, just to make sure they are straight. And I can see the gap here is tapered. So I know, like the others, these ends were not machined square. It matters less, I think, in this design, just because this thing is, in my mind, much more robust than sticks. So I've had better luck with this than the other types. So the other thing to consider is these rails are 1,600 millimeters. So 3,200 millimeters, 126 inches. There's no problem with length at either end. So that's really handy. And then, it's easy to take apart. So if you can swing it, if you're interested in a Bosch or Mafell saw, I like these rails. So if you've seen anything I've done in the last year or so, you've noticed that I've been using this Makita 118-inch rail for all my long cuts. I love it. It's one piece. I never have to think about it. It saves me some time putting rails together, and it works great. So the one thing to keep in mind is that if you think of buying this and you have the possibility of picking it up locally somewhere, that's the way to go, because it's so long and the package it goes in is so long that it has to go on a semi-truck if you have it delivered. And that's why it costs so much to ship. If you have this sent to you, the shipping is going to be almost as much as the cost of the rail. So that's a bit painful. I learned that the hard way. So if you can pick one up locally, that's going to be the best way to go. Now, in contrast to the really long rails, let's talk about other lengths. Let's say in a given situation, you are ripping something that's just smaller and you don't need a big rail. Maybe it's unwieldy in that circumstance. Well, that's why we have these special slotted holes milled at various locations along the front edge of the bench. So the idea is you take your shorter rail, put the spiral dogs in, and then they just drop right into the slotted holes, like so. You can cut various lengths of workpiece that fit between those spiral dogs, and you can simply raise and lower the rail to swap pieces. And the idea is that with a slotted hole, it's easy to come out, easy to go in. So finally, I do want to mention that if you're in this configuration, it's important to remember that if you're using a Mafell or Bosch rail, since they are quite a bit narrower than Festool style rail, and the slot where you attach the spiral dog is in a little bit different position relative to the splinter guard, if you use the slotted holes in the bench top to do this type of rail will be a little bit closer to the bench than this type of rail. It's not enough to matter if you're doing just vertical cuts, but it is something to keep in mind if you're thinking about doing bevel cuts.